capitalist society is necessarily based on the freedom of the formal freedom of the people who participate in it. And that is, in fact, a good emancipatory thing about capitalism. And if you don't have an account of what is limited or partial or sort of self-subverting about that freedom, then you've just handed it over. You can't make it go away as a social phenomenon, right? It is just a fundamental fact about a capitalist society that everybody is formally free to organize their lives according to the contracts they make with others. That's just a constitutive fact of our kind of society. And if you don't contest it at its heart and give an account of its limitation and what the full realization of the promise of freedom is, then you've just allowed it to be that and nothing more than that. And it's not just that you've kind of handed an ideological weapon back to the right, but you've created fundamental confusion about the real basis of people's existence.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also Philip Cunliffe in Canterbury. Hello, Phil. And it is also George Hoare in London. Phil, who's voiceless. Well, that's Phil.
Hi.
In case you didn't know.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you can let Phil say hi. I'm not voiceless. I'm the voice of the voiceless, in fact. So, yeah. How are you doing?
It's good that someone's doing that. We also have back our wonderful regular contributor, Alex Gourevitch. Hello, very patient Alex. Much more patient than the Alex that's currently speaking.
Hello to all of you.
Excellent. So we're going to be talking about a lightweight topic, freedom in the U.S. election. And we are going to, I'm following these notes that have been written out here, give Alex Gourevitch the opportunity to confess his crimes before the American people. It's obviously not all the American people, because not all of them are clever enough to listen to BungaCast, but a certain segment of our listeners are U.S. American, and in the face of them and in their ears, you can apologize or confess however you like.
So to set up this investigation into the crimes of Comrade Gourevitch, I thought I would just take us back. So a while back, I noticed that there was this piece which listeners and viewers will find in the show notes by Eric Foner, very distinguished American historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and he was talking about freedom in the American election, why freedom was at stake in the American election, but also, very intriguingly and interestingly, he said how the left needed to reclaim freedom, and that had to be part of the Democratic pitch to voters, that instead of being seen as just restrainers, they had to actually kind of claim freedom as something that was eminently compatible with the left today and the left in the past. And that sounded familiar to my ears out of lots of conversations that I've had with Alex in different contexts, but not least the work that Alex has himself done, writing for Jacobin and elsewhere, and in particular a paper that he co-wrote with Corey Robin, another guest that we've had on in the past, a while back, which was about this theme of reclaiming freedom for the American left. So I put two and two together, and wondered whether or not there was something worth exploring here a bit further. What is the link between Comrade Gourevitch and Comrade Kamala? And I thought it'd be worth thinking about a bit more. But before we do that, we also wanted to catch up with you, Alex, about your debate that you've recently had with Tyler Cowen about the justification and defense for capitalism. So can you tell us a bit about how that went?
And tell us who Tyler Cowen is for those who maybe aren't familiar as well.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, yeah.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, all of these themes are connected. So I did a debate with Tyler Cowen at MIT The topic was, is capitalism defensible? Tyler Cowen is, there's a way in which he's sort of like the Milton Friedman of our generation. He is this.
I thought of him more like the libertarian Adam Tooze.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. He's been around and kind of a major public figure for considerably longer than Adam. But yeah, so he's run this blog for 21 years called Marginal Revolution, and he has posted every single day without fail on this blog. That was how he really first came to the public light. He's a major economist at George Mason, I think the director of the Mercatus Center, which is a major kind of libertarian think tank, and that has sort of sent economists to many departments and various policy intellectuals all around DC and the rest, and is a real hub for a lot of the major libertarian policy thinking in the United States. He's also a major, not just sort of public intellectual, but sort of policy intellectual who has the ear of people like Peter Thiel and Sam Altman and other sort of major figures, especially in Silicon Valley. And a lot of his particular brand of libertarianism, it's a to my mind, a hard exactly to say what kind of libertarian he is. It's one heavy dose of a certain kind of Silicon Valley Schumpeterianism. So the great thing about capitalism is that it creates incentives for the hyper-talented to use their talents to develop cool new things that the rest of people can buy. On the other hand, he presents a lot of what he thinks is this sort of common sense, middle ground, non-ideological, evidence-based policy. He's an immense consumer of information. So one of the things about the blog, and
that's the greatest kind of comparison, I think, with Tooze, is the kind of intellectually omnivorous style, the tremendous range. I think he's actually he's more superficial than Tooze, but yeah, the approach is similar.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. The thing about Marginal Revolution, and when I was in grad school, I remember reading it a lot, and I still sometimes go to it, is that it just is sort of this endless source of information about anything. So you might get his 4-paragraph summary of 8 papers on the Polish economic miracle of the past 10 years. And then the next day it'll be a book on sort of problems with translating German in the 19th century. And then the next day it'll be a reminder about why AL solves all those problems. So there's you kind of get this just sort of constant source of interesting stuff, which has been, and he was onto this thing early, and his blog sort of stuck around after a lot of blogging kind of got overtaken by podcasting. And he also runs a podcast, which Conversations with Tyler, where he gets sort of experts in various areas he's interested in, and sort of just interrogates them, not in a confrontational way, just sort of might ask a few challenging questions, but lets them kind of speak and asks them probing questions. So his politics are libertarian, but they're not sort of, he has this thought that he's a state capacity libertarian. So sometimes he'll say, actually, we need a strong state that can fight China and help facilitate public infrastructure and change the energy grid.
That's a recent turn, I think, which is interesting as well.
It is recent, and in some ways, I think, an indication of the fact that he's always constantly thinking, and he's not a dogmatic in the way some people with his views can be. I mean, everyone can be dogmatic regardless of their views, but
I don't know who you're
he's incredibly well known and famous, and he's all over. I mean, he's traveled to more than 100 countries and spends half the year of any given year traveling around, and has reached deep into the halls of power.
Is this all set up for you to say that you won? Despite all this, I beat him.
Tell us a bit about the context of the debate.
So the context of the debate, it was a private debate. It wasn't filmed or recorded, and it was
Chatham House rules or something, or
No, so in many ways, it was meant to be more of a civil discussion. There's been this kind of explosion of these sort of civil discourse, sort of debates, but where the point isn't to pick a winner and a loser, but to have people present two sides and discuss them and disagree in a serious but civil way on a lot of college campuses. So this was in that genre. So there was no vote at the end. We each got 15 minutes of an opening statement, 5 minutes to respond. There was a bit of moderated discussion, and then a lot of questions from the audience. And what was interesting to me about the debate was that I wanted to approach it from the standpoint of some basic principles and whether capitalism lives up to them. And so I wanted to hold capitalism to sort of the highest standards we can hold a society to, and argued against the thought that I said capitalism was indefensible because it responds to people's needs the wrong way. It systematically makes people unfree in indefensible ways. And in various ways, it's undemocratic. So I chose sort of poverty, freedom, and democracy as the sort of basic, or human need, freedom and democracy as sort of basic principles we all agree are standpoints from judging whether this society is defensible or not. And Tyler was in an interesting way not interested in those kinds of principled arguments. He wanted to keep us focused on the facts of the matter and what evidence. So, and I've seen him make this kind of argument before, but things like, well, America, which is sort of the heartland of capitalism, is where anyone who comes to America does better than if they'd stay in their home country, things like that. So immigrants to America do better than the same kinds of people in their home country. The quality of work keeps getting better. All those kinds of empirical claims about how things are getting better, not worse. Capitalism constantly innovates and creates new opportunities for people. All of the complaints I have, the evidence suggests, are all problems that are getting better, and they're getting better because of capitalism, not because of any of our non-capitalist features of our states. And so what was interesting to me was I had actually a lot of trouble getting him to sort of accept the principles like equal freedom as the standard for judging a society. It wasn't really in that sense, it wasn't a principled debate, not because he's an unprincipled person, but his main argument, which is for this podcast, a kind of interesting one, is you have no better alternative. Haven't we learned from the 20th century that there are no alternatives, or that all the alternatives are worse, I should say.
I guess
So
that's
were
not surprising.
You were talking past each other then. You were talking from principles and he was talking in this kind of empirical, pragmatic way.
That was my experience of the debate. And I think what was interesting to me about it is, having done debates like this for 15 years, this was one of the few I've done where the argument that the 20th century tells us that all the alternatives is worse fell flat. It seemed to me it fell flat with the audience. It didn't seem to have the punch it had. People understood that there are standards to which we're going to hold our society, including whether everybody has the freedoms they ought to have, that it's wrong to force some people to end up knee-deep in poultry guts, or making beds in hotels they can't afford for their entire life, while other people aren't forced to work at all. People understand that there's something systematically wrong with a class structure like that and an economic structure like that. It apportions freedom and force in the wrong way. And people understood that in a way, I think the argument that all the alternatives are worse started to sound complacent. It's sort of morally and politically complacent, rather than, how did that
come across in the room? That sense of complacency on Tyler's part.
Well, I accused him of complacency. That's one way it came across. As I said,
that's not very civil.
That's this. I mean, excuse me. No, I put it a bit more civilly than that, but I said I don't think that we should be so complacent as to think that we can't hold society to certain standards, principled standards, including standards capitalism that come out of capitalist societies themselves. the value of democracy, the importance of human freedom, and producing for the sake of universal wealth are standards that capitalist societies generate. They aren't sort of somehow imposed from the outside. So it also came up, though, in the questions that the audience asked. So the audience did want to know more about what I thought the alternatives were, but they also were sort of challenging Tyler on these points. There were quite a few questions, if I recall correctly. I'm trying to reconstruct the flow of the debate, which is hard to do. But there were many questions people had in which were varieties of, do you really think this is the best we can get? And that was where the sort of policy side of Tyler's, well, he said, no, well, I've got a 17-point plan. He said, there's 17 things. As I recall, he has a specific number of things he thinks we should do. And that was his response. And what was interesting about some of his proposals is they sound as much like they're cribbed from a DSA policy sheet as they do from the Cato Institute. They're a mishmash of different policies. So he has a lot of policies. I don't think he really has a politics for any of those policies to explain why we'd get any of them. But
it's interesting, right? Because I guess the one thing that, when you're defending capitalism, you can't really do is point to all of these new solutions to problems, all of these new technologies. There is no, I think that's one of the most fundamental things. Like, however unfair and unfree capitalism might be, at least historical justification is it was always creating new needs, new wants, new solutions, new technologies. And that seems completely like, I don't know anybody who's really buying that. Have you used the latest iPhone? It's really different to the 16 that preceded it.
So
really?
Tyler will cite research, the happiness research. I mean, he is such an omnivore when it comes to consuming research. He's sort of like one of these large language models, but he's a human being, and he can just processes all this information and remembers it. And so he has at his fingertips, for instance, the latest in the happiness research. And his view is that it proves, I mean, I disagree with this, but this happiness research proves that in fact people's lives are getting better. Under that they get continuously better as societies get wealthier. So there's no plateau. There's some variety of happiness research which says it bottoms out or it flattens out at a certain threshold.
What was your alternative out of interest when the audience challenged you? What did you say?
It wasn't fascism, was it? Oh, come on.
Yes, that well-known regime of freedom and democracy. So what I said was, it was some form of democratic socialism because I had to put a name to it. But of course, when we say that, sometimes that's associated with a particular candidate or political organization. So I had to clarify that it isn't go support Bernie Sanders or something like that, because I tend to think that they haven't really thought through very deeply what these alternatives would be either. But that it would be a society in which everybody has to share the difficult labor so that everybody can engage in some form of complex activities that allow them to develop some of their talents, and nobody's forced to spend all of their time in routine, simple, or difficult labor. And that's comprehensively democratic in all of its basic social forms. So not just in the state, but in the control over the workplace and the wider economy. So I left it at that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion we've had before. So, and we're going to give you the opportunity to talk more about what freedom means in this context in a way that Bernie doesn't. And I guess that you didn't perhaps have in the opportunity of that debate. But in the interest of promoting uncivil debate, tell us who won the debate then.
Well, it isn't very fair since he's not here to give his perspective, is it?
Okay.
I certainly came away thinking that I had made a better case than he had. And
did anyone confirm this impression to you from the floor, or?
Well, I got confirmation from my friends, but they are my friends after all.
I mean, that's the great thing about capitalism. Everyone can come away from the marketplace of ideas feeling like they were right. And
Absolutely.
They did the right thing.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
What I don't know is if there was anybody who was undecided who shifted. That is, so the disadvantage of this particular way of doing a debate, I mean, there were 250 to 300 people in the audience.
That's a good turnout.
Yes, they had to change the room to the largest I was told it was the largest auditorium at MIT because there was so much interest. And he's so well known that he could probably pack an auditorium of 1,000 people with enough advance notice in any major city. So, and I made sure to tell enough of my friends that I had some there too. But
maybe we should get him on next week and ask him how.
Yeah,
how
Zach, if you want to quadruple your
go?
listenership, if you want to quadruple your listenership, that's a way to do it.
This brings us to the question of the hour. So, which is why freedom seems to be percolating into the discourse of the American left, and particularly that it's being used as part of Kamala's electioneering. And this flows, in fact, I mean, mainly we were curious to hear about your debate with Tyler, but it turns out it seems that it flows very, very well from the debate with Tyler as well.
Yeah.
So when I mentioned this to you, that this thing that Eric Foner wrote sounded very familiar to me, you said that it reads like he's received a memo, because you had noticed as well that a number of different commentators had started talking about the need for the left to reclaim freedom in these final months in the run-up to the actual presidential vote in a couple of weeks' time. And so could you tell us a bit about where else you've encountered this discourse of the left reclaiming freedom in the last few weeks or so?
So it was even stranger now that I've had a few weeks from the convention, which is in the run up to the convention, there was suddenly a flurry of little opinion pieces, email blasts, donor emails. I sometimes get donor emails I'm on some lists. Once they start selling the lists, you can never get off them. And all of them were suddenly talking about freedom in like the 10 days before the convention and a few days after. And the Foner comes to it honestly. He wrote an absolutely fantastic, in some ways, all of his history has been about the problem of freedom in America, from his book on Reconstruction, but also his absolutely fantastic book, The History of American Freedom. Is that what it's called? Freedom, the History in Freedom and American
The story of American freedom.
Yes, The Story of American Freedom. That's it. It's a fantastic book that really tries to tell a kind of story about the role that freedom's played from the colonial period to the present. So he's really come by it honestly, and as a kind of left-wing historian, understands that to be what the left is about. And so I think he was sort of noticing something, but it was odd. And I wondered what was going on, because also that has completely disappeared. I don't see any more discussion about it as what Kamala is about. There aren't any more think pieces about freedom. It was really concentrated around the convention. And I've been trying to think about what it is. Instead, we've seen a return to the two standard features of Democratic campaigns, which are lesser evilism, you can't vote for Trump, and micro-targeting, an agenda for Black men, that kind of thing.
So what was it about then? What was that period of talking about freedom about? And where else? I mean, were there any other key figures you saw kind of talking in those terms?
Oh, that's a good question. So it reached its high point, I think, during Tim Walz's acceptance speech at the Democratic Party convention, when his speech was sort of their freedom and ours. And he actually had a very good line, which is the freedom of the freedom of the Republican Party is the freedom of bankers to make money and the freedom of the rich to keep it, or something like that. While our freedom is the freedom of everybody to choose how they want to live their lives and to enjoy the economic opportunities necessary to determine what their lives will be like, something like that. And it was a really good argument, because one was a kind of universal appeal that explains to everyone the kind of freedom everybody would want to have. And it showed the Republican view to be one. I'm not saying this is what is true about the Democratic platform, but as a rhetorical moment, it was pretty effective, because it
was very striking. I mean, it was extraordinarily different as well from the usual Democratic discourse, at least as I've kind of experienced it, about almost always predicated on vulnerability and kind of micro-targeting, like you say. So it's very striking to hear this kind of soaring rhetoric. and probably not accidental that it came also from the guy who was intended to pitch to the kind of potential Midwestern swing voter.
Absolutely.
Have you noticed Kamala talking those terms?
She did a bit in the lead up to the convention. I have not. It's been hard to find very much. I mean, I've listened to some campaign speeches, but it hasn't really been a big part of her campaign that I've noticed. One thing that makes it very hard to know exactly what's going on with the campaign is that there isn't a single campaign. You get the only moment when you have a single national campaign is during the convention or during the presidential debates. This is why I think we saw it, all the discussion of freedom around the convention, because that's the one moment when the party has to claim that it's speaking to everyone, that it's uniting a broad group of people into a single and unified body pursuing a common aim. And that's when it was natural to try to find some kind of principle that explained what the party's about. The minute it doesn't have sort of everyone's attention in the same way at the same moment, it turns into different media markets with targeted ads. And so what I hear and notice about what Kamala's campaign is about is going to be different from what the campaign is in Michigan, and it's going to be different from what it is in Arizona, and different whether it's a radio ad or a Facebook ad or a television ad. So the moment, the reason freedom had its moment, and it was really just a moment, I think was not just, although I think I agree with you that Waltz is there to speak to the kind of Midwestern working class, but also because that's the only moment when the party's really a party and not just a vote getting machine that is using whatever tricks it has up its sleeve to try and sort of induce, incentivize, convince, bully different groups.
So you made this pitch, you and Corey made this pitch a while back about the need for the left to reclaim freedom. And before we talk about, how far that has impacted on American political debate and public debate, can you talk us through the paper that you wrote with Corey?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason we're talking about it is that I did have this slightly unnerved moment that when I saw all this discussion about freedom, it had a political prehistory. I think abortion and the politics around abortion and the success of abortion as a campaign issue for the Democrats was, I think, a major reason that they were thinking about freedom as possibly a unifying thing, because it is a freedom issue. Being forced to have a child is a form of involuntary servitude. So you can very compellingly make this the basis for a lot wider argument about freedom. But I did also wonder sort of why are they suddenly talking about it? And Corey and I had published an article in Polity magazine that was part of a special issue that was supposed to be, I guess this was 2 years ago now, sort of a set of ideas from different people that was sort of advice for what the Democratic Party, how the Democratic Party should campaign, or how it should sort of develop its message. I wasn't all that interested in giving the Democratic Party a message. So we agreed to write it as sort of a general message to the left. And the point of the article was to say that the central and organizing principle of left-wing politics should be freedom. Now, our argument in it we can get into it, but was somewhat different, importantly different from the version that we get from someone like we got from Waltz.
We'll come to that in due course, comrade.
We will come to that in due course. Yes. No, I can tell that this is evidence that will be used in a show trial against me at some point.
The only safe thing is to say nothing and just agree to all the charges and hope for
a professor that I know once said there was a New Yorker cartoon many years ago that shows two senators walking in front of the White House, and one of them turns to the other and says, "My instinct is to do the cowardly thing. I just don't know what that is." So the cowardly thing may have been to say nothing at all, but
so when did the left give up on freedom then, according to you guys in the piece?
Yeah, so we try to tell a much longer story, and it's in part a product of both of our experience on the left, of many people reacting to us when we say freedom is a fundamental value and saying, isn't it a right-wing idea? And I've always rejected that thought. It was why I wrote my first book. It's all the things I've tried to think about and write about. But it is true that it does seem to be associated with the right. And so one thing we do in the article is try to explain that the way we've come to think about freedom is the product of a long ideological counter-revolution by the right, which was originally a reaction on the right to the fact that everyone thought freedom was a left-wing idea. And so by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, freedom, in particular, the emancipation from various forms of domination and limitation that people experience in the economy, was a calling card of the left, of these sort of emergent socialist and communist and related mass movements. And they all held out this promise that we could sort of push the economic limits on what we do downward so that we could all enjoy ample free time, that we could transform work from a kind of dull activity in which you submit to a boss into an activity in which people could kind of realize themselves. But that this requires comprehensive transformation or overcoming the constraints of a capitalist economy. And it was freedom that explained why we needed to overcome the limitations of and domination of a capitalist economy. And then there were figures like von Mises, Hayek, Friedman, who respond to this way of thinking, not by rejecting freedom, but by redescribing submission to the market and submission to a boss as a form of freedom. And it's a lot, we sort of briefly tell the sort of intellectual history of this idea. And this is sort of an ideological component of the broad right-wing sort of counter-revolution that really gets going in the 70s, the period we think of as the beginning of neoliberalism. And as we say that by the 90s, or whenever you want to date it exactly, the left, having been defeated, also retreats from freedom itself. So the political defeat of the left leads to this kind of ideological retreat from freedom, because now it looks like this weapon that was used to defeat them, rather than something that could have been used effectively as a response. There's some notable exceptions, but we didn't have time in the polity article to go into that. And it's why we propose the economy as the site for reclaiming freedom, since we think that until you really engage with how we think about the workplace, control over investment, market relationships, you can't really reclaim freedom in any comprehensive way.
So just to roll back a moment, is there a year that you would say, at least in the context of American politics, the left gave up on freedom? And what are the stakes for abandoning freedom? I don't just mean for the left, but in politics in general, in public life.
If I had to think of a year, it's not like there's a year that obviously springs to mind.
I mean, would it be with an administration, maybe with, would it be with the Carter administration, or I'm thinking of administrations of that time, or maybe a failed campaign against Ronald Reagan? Would there be kind of a key speech or moment?
Yeah, I think it's probably the defeat of the Great Society. So it's LBJ. That's the last moment when there's a domestic freedom project of any mass significance. Not because LBJ is left-wing, but there is still a large enough social force in
economic reform tied to civil rights.
Well, it's civil rights, but there's also the new left and the kind of the emancipation of personality stuff, which is linked. There's the peak of worker militancy during Vietnam, an attempt to kind of re-domesticate American foreign policy and turn it back towards the people who are being sent to die. American strike activity peaks in 1974. And if it peaks in 1974, that means in some sense, I think the defeat had already been happened sometime in the early 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, that's the defeat of the Great Society sounds, that maybe the moment also is linked to Bretton Woods and the collapse of Bretton Woods and all of that moment together.
Yeah, I would put it there also because it's the moment when whatever the ideas about sort of anti-authoritarianism and emancipated personality that were around the new left to really be a comprehensive political project required the New Left to kind of really succeed in transforming the labor movement itself and becoming, a mass class-based movement rather than a movement that sort of stalls and bleeds out into a new ideology for the professional classes. And that's why I would pick that moment as the moment. But I'd have to think a bit more about whether I want to commit myself to that thought.
No,
but
no,
it's
sure.
the one that comes to mind, I think, is the last moment where you see a politics of freedom, which I think we can say that the New Left and the wider politics around it really was a politics around freedom that had been inspired by the civil rights movement and extended it to, the Equal Rights Amendment is an extraordinary, it's the last moment of, that's the other reason is people sort of forget about the Equal Rights Amendment, but it is an attempt at dramatic constitutional revision through an act of popular sovereignty that would have extended fundamental new freedoms across the board, from abortion to access to employment to family law, as a fundamental redefinition of American citizenship. And it was popular, and large majority favored it. It's just because our Constitution's so undemocratic, it failed. It failed because of they lost it. The last state needed to ratify it. But that's, I suppose, a kind of signature. That to me, in some ways, is really a signature of the expiration of the energies, of the ability to mobilize large numbers of people around major political acts in the name of creating new freedoms.
And what are the stakes of abandoning freedom?
You lose any unifying language that could be the foundation for any democratic politics. And I think even deeper, you lose the thing that everybody has, which is the capacity to abstract from their social givenness, from the identities we happen to be born with, and act together to define what we want to be. So I think when we lose the language of freedom, we don't just lose a principle that could be a kind of aim that everybody might want and might see that they can only achieve through democratic movement, but you lose a way of addressing people simply as human beings who can determine themselves rather than just find out that they've been determined by the society that they've been born into. And once you're no longer talking to people as people who aren't already determined, then you end up with things like an agenda for Black men. You just end up with micro-targeting. You are the particular social identity that happens to be salient at the moment. You can tell that you're being somehow talked down to. And the whole political relationship that political organizations have with their membership becomes sort of inescapably paternalistic, not in the old patriarchal way, but in this way in which you're kind of explaining to people who they are, and in virtue of that, how they ought to behave, rather than presenting yourself as the product. The politics and the act of representation is no longer the act of representing the ideas and thoughts that people have and how they want to be associated. So I think
that's necessarily for the
deep,
left, right? I mean, that kind of configuration that you're laying out, that's for the left, for a left which abandons freedom, right? Because I mean, it does then recur on the right, most recently in opposition to kind of wokeness, I guess, which is like kind of, it's such an easy kind of win for the right to say we defend freedom as against these people who are telling you what you can and can't say, for example, against speech codes. But also, I mean, I see it recurring in kind of entrepreneurial ideology, which you've been on this podcast, in fact, before to talk about. But that's the way that there's a universal vision of freedom, to the extent that one still remains. It's that today, and one that has a popular appeal as well, I think, importantly, because it's not just sold as the right for shareholders to take home their earnings or something like that. Although that now increasingly is the case, as well as you have people encouraged to speculate in the stock market, buy Bitcoin, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to think of any, or there are the circumstances in which you could have a political project that has mass appeal that doesn't have some centrality given to an idea of freedom. I mean, it might be a partial one, but people are then kind of encouraged to kind of participate in whatever the preconditions for that view of freedom would be.
I mean, you did mention fascism earlier, like
Well,
jokingly, George, but that was a kind of a mass popular
yeah,
pitch.
but I mean, I guess that to me doesn't really seem very plausible today. It doesn't appeal to me. I mean, maybe you've just revealed, Alex, that it does appeal to you, and that's, you know, each to their own. I guess.
Nothing
But
human is alien to me. You know, I can try
Okay.
to
Well, there is
imaginatively
well, I
recreate
really
what is
Yeah.
because there's
The
a
only
there's a
yeah.
kind of egalitarian appeal of fascism, that we're brothers in arms here against, you know, the outsiders and those corrupting our society. So, you know, there's something which you can understand how it might appeal to someone.
I mean, just to kind of change it around a little bit, I guess what I was sort of thinking through there is, like, the only situation in which you would have you would choose to base your political program around something other than freedom is that seems on the horizon today is potentially around the climate, because you could say actually there is something that is more important than individual or collective freedom, and that's survival. It seems like it's pretty high on the list of things otherwise, because it's like equality. You know, equality is good. Maybe that's up there. That's kind of Premier League stuff. But then some of the kind of rights, or I'm trying to think of what the other things you could base your political program on. But yeah,
Right.
I mean, I guess it's one of the most foundational political
Avoiding
ideas for a
COVID.
reason, because it's very sellable, right?
Right.
Everyone wants
Right.
freedom. Freedom's good. Freedom's cool. You know,
Right.
use your freedom however you want.
Right.
Anyway, I was making the point. The stakes of abandoning freedom are, you know, you need it to get those votes, man.
It's true. I mean, so there are those on the left, I think, who see freedom as actively a problem. And that's because it means trusting people to make their own decisions. But when we do that, they might endanger us. And there are people who primarily relate to others as a potential source of threat. And when they relate to them as a potential source of threat, then they're only willing to let people have so much freedom as can be allowed them. Or put a different way, they can only be allowed to have freedom when they first prove that they are no threat. But that is obviously not freedom at all, because you can never prove that your actions aren't going to affect or harm someone else. You can't make freedom conditional on proving that you're not a threat, because then what you're saying is that you're just under the will of whoever might be worried about you. So that doesn't end up being freedom at all. It just means you get to do what you want at our discretion. So I think, and that came out in during COVID a lot, I thought. The other is the climate thing, which is sort of like politically speaking, it's a souped up version, because what people can't really accept is that the only acceptable way to manage climate change would be democratically. Because there's going to be more than one way to manage climate changes. You could do it through war. You could just try to wildly unequally distribute any of the effects of changes in the climate, and all kinds of changes in the patterns of food availability, food production, the availability of energy, and so on. So the attempt, I think, to say, well, the climate overwhelms or supplants any interest in freedom is, to that degree, I think, just another expression of the thought that people don't trust, that those who say that don't trust anyone else with their own judgments about how we ought to act in the face of significant social and environmental changes. So it's in some ways, that way of thinking is one of the ones I find most problematic, because it isn't just a kind of retreat in the face of the right-wing appropriation of freedom. It's one that really sees freedom as itself the problem to be managed and controlled, which means everything. Individual self-determination, democratic decision-making is all subordinate to those who arrogate themselves the right to judge when people get to make decisions about politically important issues as opposed to when they don't.
So how do you propose to reclaim freedom in your paper?
Yes, that's a hard one. We thought about it a lot, and I was sort of rereading the essay. The approach we take, which I still stand by, is that instead of coming up with a menu of policies that would articulate a free society, we think that the key now, the most important thing, would be politics, not policy. Freedom has to be something that large numbers of people have to want and are ready to struggle for. And it really isn't something that where we can clearly say which policies articulate that particular struggle, because it has to be more organically connected to the kinds of political struggles that people are engaging in. Since anyhow, the freedom that we have in mind is a freedom connected to activities of collective self-determination. So we don't really think that it was valid to say a politics of freedom is the politics of the following. We name a few things as examples of policies that would, under the right conditions, be emancipatory, but not because we thought that they are the policies before which every social movement must sort of bend the knee. That to us, a politics of freedom is first and foremost going to be the kind of thing that emerges out of collective action by people who want to continue to be able to collectively determine their lives. And it isn't obvious to me which issues and even which policy demands, as it were, would be the expression of that. I've actually been I was enthusiastic in a tempered way about the response to the abortion decision in the US.
Well, I was just going to ask you about abortion. I mean, surely that would be an obvious one.
Well, I mean, which is that immediately afterwards, there were a series of constitutional referendums in different states, and in which uniformly, when people were asked directly whether they wanted abortion rights, they voted it in red states and in blue states. I mean, in blue states, it was already pretty protected at the state level. But there were a number of red or purple states where there were, a constitutional referendum is about as popular thing as you can do. You're asking everybody what they think about a fundamental issue. And it was instituted in most cases, I believe, in the form of rewriting constitutions. So that's a pretty dramatic act of popular sovereignty. And it uniformly went in the way of unless I missed an example, uniformly or overwhelmingly went in favor of people exercising their vote to institute abortion rights. The places where it was restricted was primarily through state legislatures, which themselves are somewhat sort of artificially tilted in many of these states to be not particularly representative of their own populations. Some of them are genuinely representative of conservative populations. But I'm pretty sure that even in some of those states, I think Arizona is a good example. In fact, I think it's on the ballot in Arizona, so we'll see. But the legislature or a court case led to restriction of abortion rights, and I'm pretty certain it's on the ballot in Arizona, and is probably headed for another victory for abortion rights. So that's the kind of example of people realizing they can win fundamental liberties through mass collective action. But it isn't clear to me where that energy is going to come from. And in that sense, I'm pessimistic about the short-term prospects.
So this goes then to connect this to the current debates on freedom in the US election. Can you tell us a little bit so you wrote this paper a couple of years ago. Can you tell us how the paper was received on the academic left and in wider democratic circles? Because I understand it's the most widely read paper that was ever published in polity.
Not ever. It was the last time I checked, which was many months ago, but I don't know why it would change. Of all of the articles that Polity published that year, it was overwhelmingly the most downloaded. And it seemed to circulate pretty widely. And I know it immediately became something that sort of, people I knew in even the policy think tank world were reading and thinking about, which sort of surprised me, because usually these things, you write them up, in this sort of mad mad professor way. You sit in your office for a week writing this thing like, oh, this is exactly what we say. And then it gets published and it lands with a thud, and 27 downloads later, it's over. But this had a lot of downloads at the time and had majorly outpaced any of the other publications in polity, at least at that time. And I knew people, I would meet people who said, oh yeah, I read that in my freshman year class for some, in some large lecture class. There were, as I said, people I knew in the sort of wider policy world who were kind of reading it and thinking about it as a way of framing it. It's not like we're the only ones. I mean, there's a lot of people who, the idea that freedom is the language for the left has been percolating among many people already.
The people took to it. I mean, they thought it was useful. They didn't push back. Like what?
Anyone who had who I've ever had extended conversations with about this embraces the thought. So it's occasionally, during COVID, no, I should say, during COVID, immediately people reversed. Quite a few people I knew kind of reversed and thought, well, if you let people exercise the civil liberties, they'll, going to endanger everybody. And so there was a very significant reversal. And in a way, there was nothing directly in the article that would have suggested otherwise. Our focus was on the economy and the workplace. We didn't actually have a direct account of civil liberties and why they're fundamental. Which, it was a short piece. It couldn't be a comprehensive view of a free political society or how freedom is a principle that relates to all areas of social and political life. But yeah, as far as I can tell, people sort of like the thought, and there's already been a number of people who had been thinking in parallel ways. I suppose that was a discovery, was discovering that there are a lot of people who've been thinking in parallel ways. I mean, a range of people. So in the kind of lefty, in the sort of left liberal policy world, there are people like Mike Consul and Sabeel Rahman who I've sort of known about and known for a long time, who were kind of trying to develop. The Roosevelt Institute's been trying to develop sort of a liberal left policy shop and think tank that has connections in DC. And I think they've been thinking a lot about how to get this language into the Democratic Party. I just don't think it organically fits with the Democratic Party at the end of the day, because for it to be anything more than a few policy ideas that they think might help them win votes, it would have to become a different kind of political party. It'd have to become a political party that gives up on just being not the Republicans and about micro-targeting voters, and instead try to be a comprehensively representative institution that appeals to people on a mass basis and is democratically accountable to its members. I mean, it's such a sclerotic machine that I don't think it can really incorporate these except in some kind of deformed sense. But there are sincere and genuine people who, like the people I mentioned, I mean, that's just a few. And there's a lot of people thinking about domination, the problem of domination in and around the academy, thinking about politics of freedom. I know people right now who are writing books about the politics of freedom. There's been a big sort of, I don't know, this is sort of lefty philosophy. It's not politics, but there was just a pretty interesting debate between Will Roberts and Jensen Souther on how to think about politics of freedom and its relationship to agency. So I think at many different levels, there is a working back of this idea. And I think a working back of this idea, because people do think at various levels that having lost that one way or another, left-wing politics, what brought people to left-wing politics or what it's about is still about freedom and emancipation. Also because
I think because I mean, often I was thinking, hearing you say this, and particularly in relation to the preceding discussion about COVID and about climate change, where they're the best, like to kind of put it in the best light you could, one it doesn't deserve, but nevertheless, it would be that it's a universal project, right? It's something that we can all
Right.
rally around, and that tends to be the left's instinct, I think, and in its attempt to resolve its own crisis, to try to get everybody to rally together around some some universal collective project. And that's the appeal. That was always the appeal. I mean, from the new left on, of talking about the environment, because it meant that we were all humans together finally, as if we encountered aliens, that now we speak as we're from planet Earth. That's who we all are, and so that we're bound on that basis, and then we can commit ourselves to a collective project against kind of nationalisms and war and whatever else. And I guess that would continue to be the impediment to the generalization of freedom being the language through which left politics is spoken, to put in the terms that you use there. That it doesn't seem immediately, I think, to provide that kind of sense of let's all collectively rally around something. I don't know if you have that sense as well.
As you say, I think there is a universality of fear, which has a certain kind of a feel, because it seems like a bit of a short circuit, because its universality isn't something you have to convince people of. It's to explain why we don't have time for the argument at the moment. But I was thinking sort of what accounts for why we see people talking about freedom at various levels and in various directions. And if you kind of step back and think about the last 10 years, despite the fact that kind of the call it Sanders moment is over, there was, on the one hand, there was the kind of growth of interest in whatever socialism is or might be. And it's sent a lot of people back to kind of basic principles, like what is socialism supposed to be about anyway? What would it mean to recover it now in this sort of moment? There have also been all of these other more concrete political struggles around things where the only common element really is freedom. So mass incarceration, racial injustice, abortion. So one of the things I've noticed is people I know who are really committed to a particular project, call it prison abolition, call it, abortion rights or socialist feminism, even sort of more broadly. When I talk to them, they all sense that the universal element in their struggle is a kind of freedom. And that what's been missing is some way of thinking about how those local and particular struggles might be part of something wider. And there was conceivably a moment to make something more of them. I do think that political moment is past, and it's really noticeable, actually, kind of how politically passive things are and have been, especially under Biden. But if there's a political basis for the renewal of this interest, and for why the universality of a language of fear might be available to compete with, the universality of a language of freedom is available to compete with fear. It might just be the kind of that historical moment, which gave it something, sort of made it concrete. The difficulty in this discussion is making the argument concrete. And those were a series of particular struggles for particular, if not limited, but local political ends.
Just a question on freedom in the workplace, that it just got me thinking when you were talking about the kind of the partial, like how some things are universal and some things are probably not universalizable. I think I've been here. Well, no, I have definitely been hearing more about freedom in the workplace, but in a very specific sort of set of terms. I mean, this is more flexibility. So this is the kind of the capitalist idea, perhaps, of freedom in the workplace. It's like,
absolutely.
Oh, well, you can work from home, i.e. you can have an office in your house if you do knowledge work. You can have the flexibility to work only when you want to, 0 hours contract. That means you don't have to work if you don't want to, eat or pay your rent or whatever. But is that a danger, that this kind of idea of freedom in the workplace becomes co-opted, and so we end up with this kind of formally free, or people saying it's free, but actually it's a deconstituted workplace, which is in fact, very difficult situation potentially to organize people to get a more substantive, concrete, important idea of freedom. I mean, depending on how you feel about working from home.
I mean, I think George, that is why one of the reasons Corey and I had the instinct that if you can't reclaim freedom in the economy, you're incredibly limited in your general ability to reclaim freedom. Everything, a number of the other kinds of freedom are sort of partially realizable or largely realizable in a liberal capitalist society. What isn't available is the vision we have of freedom when it comes to the organization of the economy and the control over production and investment and our productive and purposive activities. And the further point, which your example sort of, I think, brings to light, George, is that that's because a capitalist society is necessarily based on the freedom of the formal freedom of the people who participate in it. And that is, in fact, a good emancipatory thing about capitalism. And if you don't have an account of what is limited or partial or sort of self-subverting about that freedom, then you've just handed it over. You can't make it go away as a social phenomenon, right? It is just a fundamental fact about a capitalist society that everybody is formally free to organize their lives according to the contracts they make with others. That's just a constitutive fact of our kind of society. And if you don't contest it at its heart and give an account of its limitation and what the full realization of the promise of freedom is, then you've just allowed it to be that and nothing more than that. And it's not just that you've kind of handed an ideological weapon back to the right, but you've created fundamental confusion about the real basis of people's existence.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, to return to the topic at the top, that's why capitalism is defensible, because it is free, and why it's not fully defensible, because it's not fully free. I mean, I could have, I wouldn't have been able to spin that out to 15-minute opening speech, but that would be my riposte to Tyler in 15 seconds.
Right. And that was, one of the interesting moments was when I said, look, if we have to have things like Amazon warehouses, then nobody should have to live their whole lives doing a job like that, forced to do a job like that just in order to make ends meet. And Tyler was horrified at the thought that meant that everybody should have to do a little bit of that labor. He was like, what? So MIT professors should have to spend a year or two in Amazon warehouse? And I said,
or in the fields.
Yes. Well, I said, well, yes, if that's what it takes for nobody to have to spend all of their life doing it. And it was kind of an interesting moment because for him, it raised the specter of the cancellation of freedom. That this vision of freedom that I have, that nobody's forced into these sort of stultifying and limiting and sort of simple occupations for their whole life. And that we can't say everybody is free in the way they ought to be free if that's the kind of society you have. The response has to be, the counter response to the left has to be, oh, their vision of freedom is really the one that leads to dictatorship. It has to be the road to serfdom kind of response. And that was, it was no accident, I think, that Hayek named the book Road to Serfdom. He had to say that any attempt to rearrange or limit the wildly unequal restraints that the economy puts on people just led necessarily away from freedom and down the road to serfdom, and was telling that it's serfdom. He doesn't say dictatorship. He has to say that actually, no, that's the economy that leads to all workers, the majority of people being kind of enslaved to the state or something like that.
I have to say, I mean, I still have my reservations about your model of redistributing undesirable labor. And we've had this discussion before.
In the Amazon warehouse.
Special pleading. This is still special pleading again.
No. He's just a lazy fucker who can't even figure out how to get his microphone to work.
Not at all. Quite the opposite. There are plenty of people who I think, should be put to work in Amazon warehouses for a very long time.
Well, you'll enjoy working alongside them.
I'd happily volunteer to lead some of them as long as I got to say who would be put into the warehouse. But
Hey,
notwithstanding,
who appointed you foreman? Wait, hang on.
notwithstanding that, I mean, this
Yeah.
is a debate we've had before.
Yeah.
Listeners can find the earlier episode. We'll put it in the show notes. And it might be worth reprising because if
Yeah.
it's the logical kind of if it's a logical consequences having these kinds of debates about trying to rethink what freedom might mean in the modern economy beyond the kind of nonsense about flexibility and 0 hours contracts, then I think it is worth reprising.
Absolutely.
But before that, I would like if you could say, so I mean, you've indicated some of your skepticism about how the Democrats are they've already kind of retreated from this language, like you say, it had its peak with Tim Walz's acceptance speech. But can you tell us, how would you critique what the Democrats are doing today? I mean, as in right now.
Yeah.
From the perspective developed in the paper?
Well, I think the most straightforward one is that there's two things that Democrats not only don't do, but I can't envision them doing in any plausible version of the Democrats that are a core part of the paper. The one is the actual politics of freedom. They're not interested in the mass organization and mobilization of voters to come up with their own ideas and rule themselves through a political party that they control in a democratic way.
I think that you can take for granted. I guess
I see.
A question, well, I mean, maybe you can't. I think we can at least, but I mean, and I would assume you would. A question that is left to me is, do you think, say, that the kind of top tier Democrats, the Obama Norts who are in the White House under Biden, I don't know, Kamala Harris, Waltz, whoever, their senior advisors, do they, would they feel something about the American flag being kind of intrinsically connected to a project of freedom, and America as a political project?
I see what you mean.
Or do they think, do they, as the UN, her name escapes me now, but the Biden administration's UN ambassador, who talked about, kind of the reason America is better than the others is because even though it's a genocidal colonial settler state, it's trying to come to terms with that past. And this is what makes America better than Russia.
Yeah, right.
So I'm wondering, do they actually feel that freedom is part of that? Or do you think that is kind of woke, for want of a better word, the kind of the legacy of the New Left has smothered that out among the kind of white collar professional classes that support the Democratic Party?
So I guess what I'd say is there's one thing in the paper and one thing outside it then. So the one thing in the paper is I still think that in the end, the vision of freedom as it applies to the economy in the Democratic Party is fundamentally that of the meritocratic professional classes. So they still can only really think of the problem in terms of formal equal opportunity. So does the economy really give the naturally talented the opportunity to compete in fair way with everybody else, such that at the end of that competition for college, the truly talented get the positions that they merit and then get to rule the roost as part of the natural aristocracy. And that is the meritocratic vision. It's, it was certainly the core of Obama's view. And it's just absolutely indifferent at the end of the day to those who don't win, to the 2/3 who don't even go to college and who have to spend their lives in one or another of these forms of employment that they're forced into. So, there's just nothing in the Democrats that's really willing to pick up on the thoughts that Corey and I had about every workplace is a potential site of domination to the degree that is people who have to sort of work for bosses whose interests lie in pleasing their bosses, who are driven to use labor in order to make profits. They're just indifferent to that. They think the people who end up there are just the ones who, wasted their time in high school or just weren't as talented as the ones who deserve these scarce positions of privilege and authority in the meritocracy. And to really pivot a politics of freedom in the way that Corey and I were talking about really, I think, requires reorienting how one thinks about what the fundamental problems are in the economy that are not just about equal opportunity to go to college and find a place in the professional class, but to rethink that basic structure itself. So that's inside the thing, and that would require really rethinking what the nation is for and about. It is it would require a fundamental restructuring of the national social order. And that I don't think, however patriotic they may or may not be, they don't think about American freedom or freedom in America that way. The thing that's outside of the paper is the foreign policy stuff that you brought up. And it seems to me that matters too. Because
Just to be clear, it's not foreign
Sorry.
policy exactly. I mean, it's the realm that's most familiar to me due to my my work. But it was more just this. I guess I'm trying to get a sense more of their kind of the instinctive responses of a particular group of people. So I think however cynical
Right.
and
Right.
creepy many kind of senior Republican leaders might be, I still think that a lot of them do actually think America is connected to freedom.
Yes.
And I'm not
Yes.
sure that would be the case on the
Yes.
Democratic side. And I suppose that's my question: is that right or not?
So I actually think that on the Democratic side, I think there's a lot of them who love the American state. I do not know how much they love, let's say, the American nation. So they are really committed, maybe more committed than Republicans, to the American state and the idea of this sort of professional, competent, technocratic apparatus that sort of solves problems domestically and internationally. To the degree that that's linked to a kind of not just love of the state, but sort of special thought about America being connected to freedom, I don't think that it's exactly freedom, but it's a certain romantic view of American politics as self-correcting. So that famous line from Clinton that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what is right with America. Now, that's not really an argument about America being free exactly, but it is connected with it being sort of this liberal democratic nation. In virtue of the fact that it's a liberal democratic nation, it doesn't tend to the sclerotic, regressive features of those other regimes that are autocratic. And so there's sort of a loose thought about democracy. But of course, it then what leads them to think that they've got special authority to manage global affairs, and as a consequence, sort of stamp out and undermine democracy elsewhere. But that would be my answer on that ground. I think that's what's expressed, and I also can't remember her name, but that's the kind of self-deceiving, romantic sort of cultural leitmotif of
Yes, so that's the romance for the Democrats of what America
yeah.
means, yeah.
Yeah.
As opposed to the kind of the hackneyed, don't tread on me kind of
Yeah.
libertarian wing of the Republican Party. Yeah.
Can I just say one other thing, though, about the Republican Party and the Trump wing, which is absolutely not libertarian, really, except for that it does give the libertarians the thing they've always wanted the most, which is large tax cuts, which is that it is true that there is a way that Trump represents an image of freedom in a kind of distorted way, which is not the libertarian one, but it's one that, in a way we associate with certain kinds of revanchist right-wing politics, which is transgression. The guy refuses to follow any norms whatsoever. He, unlike any other politician, in fact, says exactly what's on his mind. And he does it in a way that upsets everybody who sets the ordinary terms of public discourse. And in saying all the things you're not supposed to say, he transgresses the rules. And rule breaking is a kind of form that freedom can take. And one can understand that kind of appeal. It's infantile, it's childish, it's limited, it has no connection to any material change in one's life.
Yeah, but it also
it is linked to the experiences of disrespect, frustration, and suppression that people feel,
and the super
their wider
ego.
social life.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the super ego of the kind of professional managerial classes as well. This kind of suffocating etiquette that the college educated tell you have to kind of observe and abide by.
Yeah. I do think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, that is the fundamental pitch, I think, of the Trumpian right in the US and its analogs elsewhere.
Right.
in
Yeah, I mean,
most places I can think of.
perfected by Silvio, very famously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I still think in the end, one's a fool to think you're going to get anything from him or from that. But
But I think the point is also you enjoy it along the way, and that's part of the limits of the Trumpian kind of appeal as well.
Yeah.
It's
The real-
enjoyable.
The real freedom is the jokes at Democrats' expense that we heard along the way.
yeah, you get to say it. And I think, but it is connected to the meritocratic thing that I mentioned before, right? If you've set up society to say that 2/3 roughly are going to occupy positions that are not publicly respected, that are considered failure, because success is victory in a race that is supposedly fair or roughly fair, or when it's unfair, there's only very specific groups who are recognized as suffering from the unfairness and injustice of the setup, and then getting special advantage, special help in competing for these opportunities. But that no matter what, at the end of the day, we just know the structure set up where there's only about 1/3 of the people who are going to end up in positions of respect, who are going to know how to operate within that discourse, that there is a legitimate grievance that can be kind of preyed upon and managed. And if you're not going to get anything else, then perhaps, you get this sort of trivial frisson of participating in at least the transgression of the kind of major social structure. So
I mean, I think it's another confluence there with the entrepreneurial ethic as well. I mean, that it's kind of both
absolutely.
at once, that I have the freedom to go
absolutely.
about and to hustle, and I might not have a university degree, but I'm going to make it. And also I'm not going to let anyone to tell me what I can and can't say.
You disrupt, right? You disrupt you're a disruptor.
Absolutely.
You bring a new kind of invention or process to the market, to the industry. And I think that's probably the appeal to a certain wing of the.
And also, I don't play by the rules. I can cheat on my taxes, whatever. It's a special liberty. I mean, I think it's a plea for special liberty, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, this is why I don't think it's any accident Elon Musk is running around campaigning with Trump. And it's why I think I said when we did the podcast about entrepreneurial ideology and entrepreneurship, that there is something importantly distinct between that and, say, the meritocracy. Because on the one hand, they're both ways of thinking that involve us thinking there are just naturally superior, naturally talented people, and then untalented, inferior people. They're both ways of establishing who that is. The meritocracy does it one way, the entrepreneurial ideology does it the other way, but you would think that in one way they'd have a strong affinity because they both reside on this belief that there's some, just naturally superior people who deserve their social power and hierarchical sort of privileges in virtue of that natural superiority. But I think the difference is that the meritocracy runs on this kind of fantasy that they got there because they played by the rules of the game, and therefore they have to support the rules of the game because the rules of the game are part of what legitimate them occupying these scarce positions and establish that they're better than others. While the entrepreneurs fantasize that they're making the rules.
Yeah.
Which is why they get to break them. Because if you break them and then succeed, then you make them. And that's the kind of Nietzschean aspect.
Yes, and that's the internal tension in what Michael Lind would call the overclass, I think, which is probably why they're not exactly a class either. But I think that's absolutely right. That's the kind of the tension, because the oligarchs. He doesn't say that. My point is that's kind of the breach within his concept. Because he says they're kind of extraordinarily proximate to each other, whereas you've pointed out there's a fundamental conflict over the nature of social authority and rules. The oligarchic kind of Silicon Valley elite, the Silicon Valley elite, they want to make the rules as opposed to those, like you say, who have a kind of vested interest in observing kind of the existing rules and shoring them up.
Though it's interesting. It's funny that you say Silicon Valley elite, because when I was thinking about the entrepreneurial ideology, I wasn't thinking about the Silicon Valley elite. I mean, there might be one of the purveyors of it or some of the successful examples of it, but it plays much more widely. And it's taken up by voices which are not them. But they're the kind of exemplars and leaders of it, and of course they'll have support from kind of all sorts of people who are in much
reduced circumstances, but imagine, kind of self-employment is kind of the means of escape and creating rules for yourself.
Just one thing I just wanted to say about the Trump thing, because there was about the Musk and Trump thing, because there was that photo which was captured some. I think that people spent about a week laughing at it. This was like last week when it's Musk at a Trump rally and he's jumping up in the air going, "Yay!" And it looks ridiculous because he's one of the most powerful and rich men in the entire world, and he's acting like a little guy, and like he's acting like one of the little guys cheerleading. And there's this weird thing of him being a big guy, one of the biggest
Very
of the big guys,
infantile,
pretending to be the little guy,
but sure,
also aligning with the big guy.
I have to say, when I saw that, I had to tip my hat to Donald Trump. I mean, he even made Elon Musk seem like a beta. I was like, wow, look at you. This guy is embarrassing himself for you. I don't know how you did that, but hats off, because that is just, it's just hard to think. I was going to say that this discussion about the internal division within the overclass might be an insight into why there sort of what's going on with the fears about democratic erosion among Democrats in response to Trump. Because one of the noticeable things about democratic erosion is that many of the things that got eroded under Trump were constitutional norms, but they weren't democratic ones. And so there was this blurring of the erosion of just the existing legal and constitutional norms versus the erosion of democracy per se, such that to defend democracy meant just defending the Constitution, even though the Constitution itself is wildly undemocratic. And democracy, meanwhile, is often, Corey Robin made this point a while back, that democracy really is often an activity of norm erosion, because you're often replacing old norms with new ones. And I've sort of been puzzling about this kind of way in which this concern about democratic erosion gets articulated among within and among the Democratic Party. And I do think it's sort of that commitment to the rules. And they understand that, so they have to affirm democracy since it's part of our rules. But it's a sort of formal element within the broader structure of playing by the rules.
Yeah, that's the extent of their commitment to democracy.
Yeah.
But this takes us nicely onto our final question, Alex, which is where we began, kind of circling back to where we began. So when the great wind blows and thine hour comes, what will you say before the American people about your role in getting Kamala Harris elected?
Well, it was the finest achievement in my life that stands next to, possibly slightly above, having 2 children.
I'm not sure that's the answer the American people will want to hear.
No, they won't. I can only hope that the rumors are false.
I guess that depends who's making the rumors. I mean, I've heard all sorts of rumors.
Yes, I'm sure you've heard all those rumors you started.
Well, thank you very much for coming on once again. It's great to have you back, and I guess given how unpredictable it does seem like a coin toss at the moment, everything about the American election, which is happening shortly, it's something we'll be revisiting in due course. I mean, goes without saying.
Absolutely.
And we'll be talking about with you in future, no doubt, as well. So, but this has been tremendous, and also to connect it to kind of deeper debates rather than just talking about who's ahead in the 2-horse race. So,
absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers, Alex.